Please do carry on those conversations after the service over some refreshments. But you'll notice I've been joined on the stage by my friend Sam, who's going to share a bit of his story with us. So, Sam, thanks for being willing to share with us this morning. Why don't you start by introducing yourself and telling us just a bit about day-to-day life for you?
So, I'm Sam. I'm married to Katie, and we have 4 children. We've got Daniel, who's 8. Matty, he's age 3. William, he's 10 months, I think. And then we've had Alice as well, who's in heaven. And then I'm a physiotherapist day to day. I work for a GP surgery in Droitwich, and also then a more regular physiotherapy clinic in Worcester 1 day a week. Outside of work, you probably find me running around Warden Villages, trying to keep fit and play a bit of football. And if I'm not doing that, I'm kind of doing a DIY task or something around the home, in the garden, or indoors, yeah.
I think you've understated that bit. Sam is really, really good at DIY. Do you still have your Instagram account, DIY Dad, or is that
no,
long
I stopped
gone?
that now.
It was good. I got good tips from that. Physios love their jobs. Every time you meet a physio, they love their jobs. Tell us what's so rewarding about being a physio.
Yeah, I do love my job. I think it's definitely the variety. No day's really the same. No 2 patients are the same. So the days just kind of fly by when I'm at work, and that's a real joy. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I do find it rewarding that I get to help people with my work, and when you can get someone on the right treatment pathway or get someone back to that activity that they want to do, that is really rewarding. So I do enjoy my job. Yeah,
that's great. Not everyone will know this because you haven't particularly got an accent, but you're not from around here. Tell us where you grew up and how you ended up in Worcester.
That's right. So I'm actually from Guernsey in the Channel Islands, which, if you don't know where that is, it's a tiny little island off the coast of France. It looks like it should be French, but I'm not French, despite the French-sounding surname. Guernsey very much part of the United Kingdom, and yeah, that's where I grew up. It's a lovely place to grow up. It's about 65, I think, 1,000 people, probably just get that pop up around the population number. And yeah, everyone always asks me, do you know everyone? And 65,000 people is enough to not know everyone. And the second question is, I know Jersey. And it's like, well, it's not Jersey. It's a bit like maybe Gloucester, Worcester, or yeah, that kind of dynamic. Yeah.
Okay. And how did you end up in Worcester then? What brought you to the mainland?
Yeah, so moved over to the mainland to train to be a physio in Southampton. Met Katie during my time at university, and yeah, really decided to stick around. We moved up to Worcester around 10 years ago now, and we've been here ever since. Great.
Now we're thinking this morning about knowing who to follow.
Yeah.
You're sharing your story because you're a Christian and you follow Jesus. Why don't you tell us how that happened? How did you first get to know Jesus, and what difference has he made to your life?
So I came to know Jesus personally for myself as quite a young child. I grew up in a Christian family, a Christian home. He brought me along to church. They shared the gospel with me, taught me about Jesus. And that was a real privilege. And there was one Easter time, so around this time of year as a child, my family went along to a dramatisation of the Easter story and Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And the gospel was preached as part of that. And something clicked for me when I was there. Even at a young age, I knew that I was a sinner. I didn't meet up to God's demands, but I needed forgiveness. But I also needed to accept Jesus as being in charge of my life and to try and follow him. And I went home that night and prayed a really simple prayer with my dad. And it was a very simple faith at that time, and a very simple understanding of that. But it's grown over time, and I've been really thankful for God's grace in my life. He's been faithful to me, even though I've not always been perfectly faithful to him, and that's been his faithfulness has been a real source of strength and comfort in some of the darkest times of life as well.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. You mentioned earlier that you have a daughter, Alice. I think we're going to see a photo of Alice. There she is, her cheeky little smile. Why don't you tell us a bit about Alice?
So that's our daughter Alice. She's still very much part of our family, even though she's no longer with us. She was born on the 13th of June, 2019, with a very serious heart condition. They actually picked that up before she was born on the 20-week scan. And I don't know, I need to try and get you to cast your mind back to GCSE biology at school. I don't know what you can remember of that, but effectively her heart was formed kind of back to front and was significantly smaller than it would normally be. And then as part of the condition, the blood vessels, the plumbing system between the heart and the lungs, what's called the pulmonary circulatory system, just didn't develop properly either. It was really, the blood vessels were very, very tiny. And so in many cases, in babies in that situation, the incredible heart surgeons at Birmingham Children's Hospital can do amazing heart surgery, which can give these babies a chance. But in Alice's case, because the blood system between the heart and the lungs wasn't developed enough, even if they could have done something to have repaired or create a functioning heart for her, it would have meant that any surgery would have ultimately been futile in her case. And that was very clear from the kind of the advice that we were given. And so really we were opened up the possibility or the option of palliative care for Alice from when she was born. And the doctors explained that when she was born, she wouldn't live very long. There was this distinct possibility that she could be stillborn or only live a few hours, maybe some days, weeks, perhaps months, but certainly not years. And wonderfully, Alice did make it through birth. And we spent the first few days in intensive care up in Birmingham, and we transferred then to Birmingham Children's Hospital. And really at Birmingham Children's Hospital, we had the specialists kind of just review things again and just make sure from what they had seen on the scan when she was in the womb was still very much the case when they could look at it properly, as it were, when she'd been born, and it was. And so at that point then we were transferred to Acorns Children's Hospice for a few weeks. And Alice was relatively stable. And so to our joy, we eventually made it home. And that was just something I'll always remember really clearly. We hadn't wanted to do things like set up a room for her or put a car seat in the car, just because we just hadn't dared to do that. We didn't know if we'd need it effectively. And so I just remember the joy and pride of being sent home from the hospice to go and rummage around the garage to pull out her car seat and put that in the car, and just the feeling of joy I felt at being able to bring her home. That was a lovely moment. And really then from there, with the incredible support of a specialist paediatric care consultant specialist in palliative paediatrics, supporting Alice, and then also as a children's nursing team within Worcester, she was able to grow and hit some milestones. She, as you can see from the picture, she wasn't much. If you looked at her, you wouldn't have known there was much wrong with her. As you can see, she had one of the biggest smiles I think I've ever seen in a baby, still to this day. She even managed to sit up by herself for a few moments. So yeah, she did grow fairly normally to start with. And she was an absolute delight. We loved having her in our lives every moment really that we had with her. We held a 6-month party for her. We knowing that it was very unlikely she would make it to her first birthday. But during those months, she would have these moments where her heart would struggle. We called them at the time. We just used to use the word episodes, which is just kind of sugarcoats it a little bit, really. In those moments, she would become really distressed. She'd be struggling to breathe. Emotionally, that was just awful to watch. All we could do in those moments was hold her as tightly as we could, try and give her as much pain relief to help keep her calm as we could. They were bad enough that each time they were happening, we wouldn't know whether that breath was going to be her last breath. We thought she would die we knew she would die in those moments. She'd then recover from those to an extent. She'd be very weak for a few days and then kind of bounce back and almost be like that in that picture a few days later. And so we kind of lived like that. There was real joy and of enjoying time with her, but then also at any moment, any one of these episodes could come, and that would be the last one. And over time, as she grew, effectively she kind of outgrew her heart and lung circulatory system. So she was just slowly not able to cope. And so those moments of distress would happen a bit more frequently. But she did make it to Christmas that year. That was really special. Yeah. She was starting to become quite weak by then. But it's a Christmas that I'll always cherish, really. That was just a lovely time to spend that together as a family. But a month later, on the 27th of January that year, or 2020 this is, I'd made it back to work. By that point, we hadn't been sure how long Alice was going to live for, and so we got to Christmas and decided then we could have potentially lived for several months further. I decided to go back and do some work part-time on reduced hours. And so we'd had a fairly normal day, almost like a regular family. Had been to work, came home, and she was smiling up at me from the sofa. I still can picture that to this day. It was all those things, one of those smiles, kind of really makes your heart warm as a dad. And she'd seemed brighter than she had been in previous weeks. She'd, up until that point, been quite weak, as I say, over Christmas. We gave her some food, put her to bed. I remember Daniel singing some songs to her, and it was really like a relatively normal day. But that night she woke up again very distressed. She'd been struggling to breathe. We did what we've done in the past. We held her tight and gave her all the pain relief and the medication that we could get into her. And she did briefly settle and almost thought that was going to be okay. And then she peacefully died in my arms. And that's a moment I'll never forget. And even though we'd been knowing that moment was going to come, it still very much felt like a shock. She'd been so well that day and so bright that day. It hit hard when it happened. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's heartbreaking, Sam, to hear that. Tell us, what difference did knowing Jesus make to you and Katie in the time caring for Alice, but also after she died?
For us, instinctively, we know and trust in a God who is a good God, and we held on really tightly to that from the outset. I think even from the moment of knowing of Alice's diagnosis, that was a truth that we were clinging to. God reveals himself in his word to be a good God, and we can trust him to always do the right thing. The Bible, we do believe that the Bible teaches that children and babies who die in infancy are welcomed into heaven, and that was a tremendous source of comfort to us throughout Alice's life. We also came to trust, we'd trusted before, but came to trust more deeply in God's sovereignty. It sounds strange, but we know that nothing occurs outside of his good and perfect plan. He can work all things together for good, even things that don't seem immediately or materially good for us in the immediate short term. And while I've sometimes wrestled with that understanding as to why tragic and really sad things happen, I did before and have processed and thought that through since Alice died. I've found comfort in Jesus' promise to be with us through trial. Psalm 23 particularly tells us, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And this verse is obviously really familiar to all of us, or to many of us here. And it reminds us that while God doesn't remove us from our hardship, he does walk alongside us through them. And I think both Katie and myself were really conscious of God's sustaining hand through that time when Alice was alive. And that truth has been something we've had to cling to and hold to, obviously during Alice's life, but also after her passing. My experience of grief is that it's an ongoing process, a journey, and I continue to feel her absence every day. And some days in the years following her death have been just as hard as when she was alive, actually. But through it all, knowing Jesus has been an immense source of comfort and strength to us. So all of that really means that whilst it's been incredibly tough at times during her life and after, and we've grieved obviously after, and we still continue to grieve. We don't do so without hope. The gospel gives real assurance in those moments of life.
Yeah, it does. I imagine, though, some people might be wondering whether there were moments when you doubted whether God's good or whether you could really trust him.
Yeah, there were, and particularly one moment I remember really vividly. It'd been one of those days where Alice had another episode. She'd very nearly died, but had recovered, and we'd just been cherishing our time with her. I wasn't ready for it to end, and I just remember praying and crying out to God through the tears, really in anguish, the most heartfelt, honest prayer I've ever prayed in my life. I just remember praying, God, I don't want her to die. Why does she have to die? I just kept repeating that over and over again. And as I say, it's the most heartfelt prayer I've ever prayed. And in that moment, God's goodness definitely looked distant to an outside observer. I would say personally, my faith, if you could measure it on a sliding barometer scale, would have been at rock bottom. And in those moments, I think this is something I knew of before, but I've reflected on and come to treasure it more, even through Alice's life. A really helpful quote from Tim Keller about moments where we might doubt God's goodness. He tells this illustration of, admittedly it's not a very pleasant one, but imagine you are sliding off a cliff, and in desperation, before you reach the edge, you reach out for a branch to save you. And he says, in that moment of reaching for the branch, strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior to weak faith in a strong branch. And in that moment, I knew my faith was weak. I didn't have huge reserves of faith that I was welling up inside. But the branch I was clinging onto is a strong branch, the promises that God gives us in his word, that he is faithful, he is good. In those moments, yeah, as I say, it wasn't extra faith coming from within, but rather who we put our faith in that matters in those moments. And as I kind of laid my soul bare before God in those moments, God didn't answer my prayer with a bolt from the blue, an answer directly, or an immediate sorting of everything out so that everything felt right in my mind. That wasn't the case, but I did experience an unexpected closeness with God in those moments. Through the tears, sitting at the dining table in our house in the earliest hours of the morning, God met with me in that moment. And I did experience a profound sense of his presence and peace going through that, which has been really reassuring and provided comfort in that moment.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful to hear. Sam, it's really clear from your story that following Jesus doesn't guarantee an easy or a pain-free life. If Jesus doesn't promise us those things, why is he still worth following?
For us, our story has very much been that Jesus is the only person who can offer real and lasting hope. And that makes a huge difference both to the here and now, the day-to-day of life, but also is of even more importance for eternity. And I think I'd just simply answer that, really.
Yeah, thank you. One more question before we wrap up. We're going to sing in a moment a song that we sang at Alice's funeral, In Christ Alone. Perhaps while the band get themselves ready, you could maybe just share a bit about why that song has been particularly helpful to you through grief and loss.
In Christ Alone is a favourite, I'm sure, for many people here. And it's what it has been one of mine, but it's taken on a kind of new significance in some way. And I hope it kind of neatly as a song kind of illustrates our story, but particularly the line from life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny, does hold particular weight for me. I was there for Alice's first cry, and I held her in the moment of her last breath, and I knew that well, I knew first and foremost that as her dad, all I could do between those moments was love and care for her as best as I could, treat her as the amazing and incredible gift from God that she was. But I couldn't save her. And yet it was a huge assurance to know that I was trusting in a loving Heavenly Father, much greater than I, who truly commands her destiny, or commanded her destiny. And that truth was very much true for Alice during her life and after. I've clung to it as I held Alice in those moments. It's been true for our family, immediate family and wider family, as we've lived through grief and the pain after Alice's death. And also, it's true for anyone listening here today. In whatever circumstances you face, or importantly, are yet to face, if you are following Jesus, if you follow him, Jesus can command your destiny. He can offer real hope and lasting hope in the face of death.
Thank you. Sam, thanks so much for sharing your story. We're so grateful to you. You're going to stay around just for a few minutes after the service if anyone wants to ask Sam a question about anything he said. But we're going to sing In Christ Alone now, so if you're able, please do stand and join us.